Hey everybody, I'm Chad or Patriot Astro, depending on where we cross paths. I continue to get great video suggestions from people at all levels in our hobby. So if you have an idea or topic you want covered, just reach out to me or ask in the comments of any of my videos. Definitely subscribe to this channel and share the videos so we can help a lot of other people too. Okay, today's topic, dew. We all know what dew is. It's that evil water that attacks telescopes at night with the sole purpose of ruining images. It's closely related to clouds, but don't even get me started on that. Before we can get into how to deal with dew management, I want to make sure you really understand dew. I'll be using YouTube's chapters like I do in every other video for those of you with little patience, so it's easier to skip ahead to the solutions. I do recommend watching the first part though, since it'll give you a much better understanding of how to deal with dew and how to understand your weather report. Okay, science time. There are a couple things you need to understand. We need to talk about the relationships between dew or condensation, relative humidity, temperature, and the dew point. Dew or condensation is what we're trying to avoid. Condensation is the water that forms on the sides of your cold drink or the inside of your air-conditioned windows during the summertime, or worse, on your telescope lenses. The dew point is the temperature where air is saturated with water vapor and condensation or dew forms. By the way, if it's cold enough, this is called frost. What does this really mean? Well, air is able to hold water in gas form, which is water vapor. The dew point is the temperature where the air at the current pressure cannot hold any more water vapor. Basically, at this temperature and pressure, the water vapor is in equilibrium and will both condense and evaporate at the same rate. If the temperature stays above the dew point, it remains as evaporated water vapor, but go below the dew point, it turns into condensation or liquid water. This condensated water likes to form on solid surfaces, like blades of grass or your telescope, but also dust and other airborne particles, which is how we get clouds and fog. Something else you should know is that air can hold more water vapor at higher temperatures, but we'll talk more about this soon. The dew point is closely related to relative humidity, and relative humidity is a ratio, and it's often given as a percentage. I'm going to simplify it a bit here. Basically, at the current pressure, it's the water vapor in the air right now as compared to the maximum amount of water vapor that can be held by that same air when it's at the dew point. Remember, at the dew point, that's when air stops holding water as vapor. So the relative humidity is at 100% when the current temperature matches the dew point. If the temperature goes any lower than the dew point, condensation forms. People often talk about how humid it is in the summer as it relates to being uncomfortable. When you understand the relationships we're talking about, you start to see that it's actually the dew point you should be looking at. Why? Well, here's an excerpt from a saturated air table for a specific pressure. Notice that the amount of water that can be held in the air doubles between each temperature step I plotted on this chart. This makes the relationship exponential. So the amount of water that can be held as vapor in the air at 90 degrees Fahrenheit is 8 times of what the air can hold at the freezing point of 32 degrees. Now let's look at the interaction of relative humidity and dew point. If the temperature were 90 degrees and the water vapor in the air was 15 grams per kilogram, we would have 50% relative humidity because it's half the amount of water we can hold in the air at that particular temperature. So likely no worry of condensation or dew. But if we had the same amount of water vapor in the air and instead the temperature was just 70 degrees, we would be at 100% relative humidity, and condensation or dew would definitely begin forming. This basically makes this a dew point chart for a specific air pressure. And if you notice, the higher the temperature, the more moisture is in the air. This is why when the weather report says the dew point is high, you can assume you will be more uncomfortable. The air gets thick and full of water vapor. All right, so let's look at the problem at hand. Why and when will dew form on my telescope? At its core, it's pretty simple, whether you understand the science or not. If the temperature of the air near your telescope drops to the dew point or below, condensation will form. And if the temperature is higher when this happens, like in the summertime, there's a lot more water in the air that can condense. Let's take a quick look at weather reports to see where you can get this data. This is a view from clear outside. See the current temperature and dew point. When these two meet, you're in trouble. Here's another look from Astrophotometry. You can see where the temperature and dew point are getting close. Just because the dew point isn't projected to reach your outside temperature doesn't mean it won't in your specific location. Plus, you should be aware that you could see condensation before the two temperatures meet, within a couple degrees. But more on that later when we get to prevention techniques. All right, so right now you're thinking, enough talk, Mr. Science. How do I prevent dew issues? Well, the trick is to make sure the air near your optics remains above the dew point. Simple, right? Let's see. Before we talk about typical dew prevention techniques, I want you to consider one case that's frequently overlooked. I had a discussion with someone recently who had obvious dew issues in their images, but the temperature the night before was nowhere near the dew point. The problem was that they took their camera lens from inside their air-conditioned home directly outdoors and started imaging. The air near the lens was initially cooled by the lens itself to below the dew point. This made for perfect condensation forming conditions on that piece of equipment. So the first dew prevention technique, acclimate your optical gear or give it time to acclimate to the outdoor conditions. This includes the optical tube, lenses, eyepieces, and even the camera. Depending on the indoor to outdoor conditions and even your type of gear, this could be minutes to even hours. The second dew prevention technique to consider is the dew shield. You can buy or even make these yourself. Some telescopes even have them built in as retractable components, like on many refractors. There are arguments about what the right length is for a dew shield, but most people agree that the length of the dew shield should be about 1.5 times your aperture for it to be effective. If you have an 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain telescope, the dew shield should be about 12 inches. So what's the good and bad about dew shields? The good is that they help delay dew and also have an added benefit of blocking stray light from entering your optical tube. The blocking stray light part is pretty obvious, but how does this help with dew prevention? Well, here comes Mr. Science again. The laws of thermodynamics tells us that heat transfer will occur between two bodies, with the heat traveling from the warmer body to the colder body. In this case, the warmer body is your telescope, and the colder body is the enormous cold night sky. See, with the telescope pointing up, your front end lens is going to be losing heat in all directions towards the sky. By adding a dew shield, we can limit the directions you can lose heat to the night sky, which slows this temperature loss. This buys you more time against reaching the dew point at the air just above your lens. You've likely seen this effect before without even realizing it. You ever look outside in the morning and see dewy grass, but notice there isn't dew right under the tree near the trunk? The area under the tree was protected from the night sky by the tree canopy itself, and the grass below never reached the dew point. It should also be noted that while your telescope will lose heat to the outside air around it until it reaches equilibrium with that temperature, your front-end optical elements can actually get below that temperature as it loses heat to the even colder night sky it is pointing up towards. This means you can form condensation even when the ambient surrounding temperature hasn't yet reached the dew point. We aren't talking about your telescope getting tens of degrees below ambient, but a couple degrees below ambient temperature is possible, which may push you to or past the dew point. So there are obvious benefits to the dew shield, but are there any issues? Possibly. If it's too long or flimsy, you may see it cause vignetting in your images. It can also be problematic if there's a breeze, since it can catch the wind and move the telescope slightly. You may also need to experiment with your flat frames to see if you need to take your flats at the end of your dew shield or just at the end of your telescope. There are mathematical equations to tell you when a shield can get too long and cause vignetting, but we're not going to go there, I promise. As a last point before we move on, if you make your own dew shield, make sure the inside is dark and flat, not shiny, to limit light reflections. And feel free to go longer or shorter on the shield if you want. I built my SCT shields using a cheap black yoga mat and used the shorter one on breezy nights and the longer one the rest of the time. We talked about slowing heat loss, but what about adding some heat? A third dew prevention technique is to actively warm the air just above the optics. The most common way to do this is to use a dew controller and dew straps. These straps are basically small, thin electric blankets for your optics. You run a current through the wire in the strap to warm it up. We're just trying to warm the air directly adjacent to your optics to keep it from reaching the dew point. I put dew straps on the front end of my telescope tube near the forward optics, as well as at the front end of my guide scope. I found putting two straps on my C8 was more successful at addressing the larger aperture, while a single strap works for my refractors. Depending on your scope, you may also need to place straps near your eyepieces as well. For those of you without the need for multiple straps, like if you're using a DSLR with a small aperture lens, there are even straps that can be powered by USB. Some newer cooled cameras like the ZWO ASI 2600 have built-in heating elements at the front end of the camera near the sensor's protective glass. You can even buy a similar anti-dew heater kit from ZWO that can be added to many of their cooled cameras that don't have the built-in elements. Looking for a DIY approach? I've even seen people strap hand warmers to their smaller lenses. Even occasional temporary use of a hairdryer throughout the night can help. Before we leave active heating as a dew prevention technique, I do want to mention that a potential negative effect is the power consumption. When planning to run off a battery, consider this power draw when sizing your battery. The final dew prevention technique I'll briefly mention today is airflow. This is often found to be more effective early on in the prevention cycle before active heating is required. You can introduce airflow to prevent pockets of cooled air from forming near optics and primary mirrors by mixing in the warmer surrounding ambient air. You tend to see this technique used more frequently with Dobsonian and Newtonian telescopes. I've seen a few people try to do this on SCTs with small, inexpensive fans, but it may not be worth the effort, and it can introduce vibration that could be undesirable when imaging. All right, to wrap up, I think this should just about put to bed the topic of dew prevention. Your goal should be to cost-effectively delay condensation as long as you can. These costs could be in dollars, power consumption, or even imaging issues like vignetting. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please leave them here in the comments. You can always also reach me at Patriot_Astro on Instagram or at my website at www.patriotastro.com. Hope this helped you out. Clear skies, clear optics, and hopefully clear images.